Aloha and welcome to Experience 53. This is part 5 of the digits application development process. This is, I think, my favorite part of the whole application development. And the reason is because here we're going to make digits way more real world. And the reason it's going to be way more real world is because up until now, with the templates or even with digits, we put all the information about the system into a single collection. And that's just not realistic. Okay, any real world application, you're going to have a lot of different kinds of information. They need to be stored in their own ways and then related to each other. And that creates the most kind of extensible system and prevents kind of management data access issues down the road. So up until now, we haven't really needed to create multiple collections because we had just this single type of information, which was contact. But now what we're going to do is we're going to extend the system so that associated with each contact is the ability for the user to add notes. So for example, let's say you're a salesman, you want to sell Henry Casanova some scuba gear. And so you want to record in your contact database all the different times you've called Henry to pester him to say, I want you to buy my snorkel or, whatever it is. Okay. And then you want to keep notes about each time you've contacted him. So that's what we're going to provide in the system now is a little form that will be embedded with each contact card where the user can type in details about an interaction with that person, hit submit, and then that will be stored with the contact along with the date that enables you to keep track of how many times you've talked to that person and what you discussed with them. So that's what we're going to do. And you might think initially, if you've just taken like ICS 211 or something, oh, well, that's easy. I'll just extend the contacts collection with an array of notes. Okay, and that might be the way you might think about it as a data structure. But that's not a good idea. The reason it's not a good idea is because if you imagine just having each contact or each note or all the notes for each contact stored as an array within each contact, imagine if you wanted to extend the system so that the admin had the ability to have a page which shows all the notes from all users organized in chronological order. Okay, so if you imagine implementing that, you realize, geez, I'm going to have to iterate through all of the contacts, extract all the notes, sort them, and then display them. And each time a new note is added, I have to redo that. It's not a good organization for different kinds of operations and capabilities that you might want in future. So what we're going to do instead is what any self-respecting database, designer, developer would do, which is to store contacts in one collection, which is what we're doing now, but then store notes in a different collection and provide, fields in the notes collection that identify the contact that it should be associated with. And that provides a lot more extensibility in the future and keeps things more organized and just easier all around to manipulate. It requires a little bit more upfront design, but in terms of coding and implementation and everything else, things are much simpler. Okay, so the basic concept is a data model. And so I know that in previous classes you thought of, kind of doing design in terms of designing, how you'd break your system down into functions, right? Well, you also have to do design in terms of how do you break down all of the information in your system into the set of collections and how are they going to relate to each other and interact together to provide the data model or information model or information architecture is another term that you'll hear. So we're going to just wade into that. I don't expect you to have any database background. And fortunately for this class, you can kind of just wade in a little bit into this whole idea of data models, and that will be perfectly adequate for the purpose of the final project. The good news is that when you eventually do take a database class, you'll already have a much better kind of understanding of what you're trying to get out of it and why it's useful. Okay? So what we're going to do in this particular session, or in part 5, is we're going to implement notes, and the way we're going to do it is by making relationships between 3 of the collections. Now, the Meteor system creates a user's collection automatically. So every time you register yourself to access the system, it's going to create a document in the user's collection. And in the case of contacts, we generally has our default accounts in settings.development.json creates 2 users, an admin at foo.com, John at foo.com. There's a mysterious field which stores the password. We won't worry about that. But it also creates a doc ID. So Mongo, whenever it creates a document in a collection, it always makes sure that there's a field called _ID, and that _ID field is filled with a long string which is unique, which is called the document ID, or doc ID for short. So the document ID associated with the user admin at foo.com is this 9G9 blah 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 blah. Okay, and similarly for John has a different one. Okay, our contacts collection, all right, is just like it has a first name, last name, address, image description, and owner. And it also has a doc ID field, and these doc IDs are again going to be distinct from all these. So doc IDs are unique across all of the different collections in the system, in the database as a whole. Okay. Now, what we're going to do in this part of the Digits application development process is create a new collection called notes. And notes will have an _ID field, just like every other system does with the doc ID. It will have the description of the note with the thing you type in. It will have a created at field, which is a timestamp, which is automatically generated when you hit submit to indicate when you actually created that note. And then it's going to also have 2 other fields. It's going to have the doc ID of the associated contact document. So in this case, the doc ID of the contact associated with this particular note on this line is this one right here. Okay, so that means the contact was Philip Johnson, and it was created by this guy John at foo.com. Okay, so the second one, different note, different timestamp, same contact ID, which means, okay, this is another note also created by John at foo.com. The third note, different description, different timestamp. This time it's associated with the Kim Binstead contact, and the owner is admin at foo.com. Okay. Now you may be asking yourself, why do I need both a contact ID and an owner? Because once I know the contact ID, I can always figure out who the owner is. I don't really need that there. And the reason why we're going to have it in this case is because it turns out to make the design of the publication for notes to be much easier. So remember, if you think about it, we don't want to provide to the client all of the notes created by every single user. That would be kind of a security privacy violation. Really what we want to do is only publish the notes associated with that user who's logged in to that client. And we're going to use the owner field in order to do that. Okay, so that's where we're going. All right. And so let's get started. Okay, so before we do it, obviously watch this just as we've been doing all along. We need to merge the contacts form branch into master. And I have not done that yet. So let me merge into the current grid, current master, current branch, this contact forms 1. And let's see if we're running Meteor. I don't think we are. Nope. Okay. And start Meteor using npm Meteor npm run start. So we'll do that just to make sure that everything looks the way it should. So if we now go to localhost 3000, ooh, not 43,000, 3,000. We get the system. Let's sign out and sign in again, just to make sure that okay, we got to add contact. That looks good. We have list contact. We've got the edit field. That's what we did last time. So everything looks pretty fine. Let's always bring up our console window, and I think that's it's a new. So there's a new issues tab. Okay, that's fine, and we can navigate around and see that we're not getting any errors in here. Okay. All right. So we're gonna have 2 rounds as always, and for this experience, I'm just gonna do it once. So the first thing is to start the timer, and we're gonna create a branch called Notes1. So even though Meteor's running, it's kind of fair game to create a new branch because that doesn't disturb the source code at all. And now we're going to create the note collection. So we're going to create a copy of the API contact directory and call the directory note, rename contacts to notes.js, and then we're going to got this schema. So let's go to here, and here's the contact directory. So we'll copy it, we'll paste it, we'll call it note. And then inside here, we'll refactor this to call it notes.js. Well, let's see what happens. Okay. So it didn't work as well as we'd hoped, but okay, so we'll call this notes collection. And new notes collection, and we'll change this to be notes collection. That has to be unique. All right, and then let's go and whoops, and we need a note contact ID and owner as string. Got it. Note contact ID and owner as string. This is getting irritating. Okay. Note contact ID and owner as string and created at as date. Created at as a date, and then I already had an owner, but whatever. All right, so that's what our schema looks like, and we defined 2 different names for our publications. It turns out we're not gonna we're only going to provide a user publication. We don't have admin level access to notes, so I'll leave it up to you. You could delete this line or you could leave it in. just for kind of standard. I don't know which is easier for you to think about. We could kind of split the difference and say, okay, well, you know, what I'll do is I'll comment. Oops, jeez. Um, I'll comment this out. And so therefore, if someone later on wants to provide an admin level publication for the notes collection, they just have to uncomment that line, but at least we're indicating right now that we don't actually ever use that variable elsewhere. So I think that's probably a nice compromise. And then we're going to export this notes object, which is a new instance of the notes collection. So that looks pretty good. Now we're going to edit publications.js to provide a publication called notes. Well, it's going to be actually notes collection publication.user that publishes all the notes associated with the currently logged in user. So let's, good grief. Okay, so let's, really having a problem getting my tabbing thing. So let's go to publications.js. And we want to find a user publication because that's the kind of publication that we want to provide for notes, where we return only the notes associated with the currently logged in user. So we'll create a copy of this publication. And what we're going to say is the name of this publication will be the notes user publication name. Notes not being defined, so we'll need to define it. Okay, and we'll return the notes, the result of finding all of the notes documents that are associated with this owner. So there we have our publication for notes. Then we create the note component. Okay, so this will be a copy of contact.jsx called note, and it displays each note. And one way to render a note is by using the semantic UI feed component. So if I open this in a new tab, what you can see is the feed component in semantic UI React is super awesome. Look at all these crazy ways that you can display feeds. All right, and it turns out we're not really going to use any of these super cool things, but we are going to use feed because that's kind of the right concept for what this notes list should be. But we'll do a very simple version of it. And in fact, what I'm going to provide to you here is the actual code for implementing it. I didn't really want to have you guys spend your WAD trying to figure out how feeds work. I just kind of wanted to show you that a feed is a cool way of doing it, and some really vanilla code that would implement that. And later on, perhaps in your project, you can create really cool looking feeds, and you'll see how to do it from having done it here. All right, so we're going to create a copy of contact.jsx called note.jsx. So contact.jsx called note.jsx. And let's see if we can contact. So that looks like a good replace all. And this displays each note. One way to render a note is by using the component where each note is a feed event. Here's some code that you can use. So let's just take that and instead of returning the card, we'll return the note. Okay, and what you can see here as well, we do need to import the feed object so we get all these feed things, and then we note that there's a property called note that needs to be passed in, And so we can say, instead of passing in a contact, we're going to pass in a note as an object. And it doesn't look like we have a link, so we can get rid of that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now we have to add the note feed to each contact. Okay, so basically what's going to happen is inside the contact, we're going to have this code which creates an extra card.content field, and then there'll be a feed top level element within which will be a whole bunch of feed events. Okay, so that's how it works. Feed, and then inside, 20 or 30 or 100 different feed events, which shows the complete feed. And the way we'll get those feed events is we're going to map through the set of notes that were passed and display them as individual note objects, which correspond or will expand into a feed event. Okay, so we'll edit contact.jsx to include the following section at the bottom of the card. So we can take this code here, go to contact.jsx, and paste in that stuff. And we'll notice we need a feed. So we'll add that. And then we'll notice we need a property called a notes, which is an array. So we can say notes prop types dot array dot is required. Okay, and then we also want to import note. So where are we? We're in contact.jsx, so we can say import, let's try this, note from note.jsx. Okay, and now we're noticing an error or a warning. And the warning has to do with element is not exported. Okay? So the problem here is that in notes.jsx, in note.jsx, we're exporting note using the default form of export. When we import it, we're importing it as a named object. So we have to say import note from note in order to get the green check mark. Okay? Sometimes it takes a little while to figure it out. Okay, so now we have we've added the feed, and we're going to pass in an array of notes, and then we will map through all those notes, and we'll return a bunch of an array of note components, which are going to contain a note, a single note, and be wrapped in feed element semantic UI syntax. Okay, so we've imported feed, and we have added a new prop called notes that is an array. We'll actually need to import note as well. Okay, now when we have a contact, we've defined what a note is. We've inserted the syntax to make sure that all those notes are going to be printed out. The problem is how do we get all those notes to list contacts? And so we have to update list contacts to get those notes and pass it to each associated contact. And so the way to do that is in list contacts. So if we go to list contacts, okay, first thing we need to do is subscribe to the notes publication as well as the contacts collection. Okay, and in order to do that, I'll make a new subscription object, and we'll subscribe to the notes user publication name. Okay, so we have to get notes from the API notes right here. And then subscription to, what we have to do is check to make sure that both subscription and subscription to .ready are true. So basically, let's just kind of review what's happening here. When we invoke Meteor subscribe, that invokes a process that goes off and tries to get all of the documents associated with this publication and get them over and put them into Minimongo. That's going to take some time, maybe not much time, but it, if there's a lot of documents that have to come over, it might, who knows, it might take 10 seconds or something. Similarly, when we get to this next line of code, call Meteor subscribe, that's going to start up, you can think of it as a process. It's not really a process, but a thread. It's going to go off and try to get the notes, okay, the notes that associated with this publication, bring it over from the server to this client, populate Minimongo. Now, that's going to take some time. We don't want to really display the page until Minimongo actually has the data that's necessary for populating the page. And so the design pattern that we use is to say, well, first of all, each subscription object has a field or a function associated with it called ready that will return true when Minimongo's got all the data associated with that subscription, false otherwise. And what I'm doing here is saying I'm making an expression that will return true only when both of these subscriptions are true or have finished processing. And then up here, the render method for this component says, okay, well, if this.props.ready returns true, then go ahead and render the page, okay, because Minimongo's got what's necessary. Otherwise, display a loading icon that indicates that we're not ready. All right, so that's how those subscriptions work. And then we want to say notes.collection.find.fetch. So just like for contacts, we want to get all the notes out of Minimongo, okay, once this subscription has completed. Okay. So we want to pass notes as a prop just like contacts. So we want to say notes. Okay, so we make the property down here. These are all going to be going on this.props. In addition, we're going to declare the prop types here so that we can make sure we're getting what we expect. And then okay, so now we've subscribed to the notes publication. We've created a prop called notes, and that's going to return all the notes associated with this this user. And then in list contacts, we'll need to update the call to pass in the associated notes. So we're going to replace the contact component here with our new one. It's going to look like this. And unfortunately, it's going to go over our, it's going to be longer than we want this field to be. So let me just do a little indentation management here. Okay, so what this says, we are in this subscription, we are getting all of the notes associated with this particular user. But when we display a particular contact, we don't want to display all the notes associated with every single contact. We only want to display the notes associated with this particular contact. So for the notes argument, the notes property within the contact component, we're going to invoke the filter operation on this notes array to filter out and leave only those notes for which the notes contact ID matches the contact ID of this contact. So let's go all the way back up here. This is our data model thing. So we're checking in our notes collection that this string for the contact ID is the same as this string. Okay, and if or whatever the string is, I should say, for a given contact that has this underscore ID, we're going to filter out from all of the notes associated with this user just the ones which match. Okay. All right. So if you've implemented everything correctly so far, you should be able to display the list contacts page without any errors in the page or console. So let's just see if that's true. List contacts. Okay. So there's no errors here. And you can see that we now have a little space underneath the edit field. That's where that feed is occurring. And we could actually go to Elements and click here, and we can see right there that there's our div extra content, there's our feed, and there's nothing in there. Okay, so that's good, and we're not getting any errors. We can look in Meteor, you can see Mini Mongo, and we have 3 contacts. We have a notes collection, but we have nothing in there, obviously, because we haven't created any notes yet. All right. Okay, so now we're going to implement our form that enables us to add notes. So we'll create a copy of addContact.jsx, use that as our kind of template for creating our add note. But add note is not its own page, right? It's actually a component. It's a little widget inside some other component. So we'll copy addContact.jsx from the pages directory, but put it into the components directory. So if we go addContact.jsx copy, we'll put it in the components and say add note.jsx. So here we are with this, and we want to replace the 2 occurrences of add contact with add note. Okay, so that's good. All right, and so it turns out that in here we have a form schema, and that was because for contacts, the schema associated with the actual collection, okay, had an owner field, but we didn't want that owner field to appear in the form, so we had to create a simpler schema, or an explicit schema to represent what we wanted in the form. The good news for notes is that our schema for the collection is exactly the thing we want for the form. So we can use notes.schema in addNote.jsx, and we can get rid of this um, variable declaration. So if we say import notes from okay, then we can say notes dot schema here to create our bridge object, which we then pass into the auto form. Okay, and then we don't need simple schema anymore because we're not creating a schema. Okay. So as noted above, each node has a note, an owner, a contact ID, and a created at field. The auto form segment should look like this. Okay, so I'm going to copy this in there, and then we'll talk about what that is. So the idea is, actually, let me add this hidden field. Whoops. So we'll update this to get rid of this. And before let me just finish. Okay, we need to add this prop. I'm going to add the prop types to declare the owner and contact ID, and I need a prop types definition, so I'll just get that from here. So the prop types is defined, and that actually has to be moved up a little bit. Okay, just trying to get rid of all the well, let me go through and okay, so the other thing we want to do is delete the grid column, and header components surrounding the call to audio form. Okay, so the grid column and header. So if we get rid of that, and grid column and header, okay, and then this, and this. Okay, I was worried that was going to happen. All right. Okay. All right, so that looks good. And let me just see that I've done everything that I need to do. And let me reorder things. Okay, so we've deleted the grid column header. The user only fills in the notes field. All the other fields are okay. Okay. Okay, so let me explain what's going on here now that we've kind of followed the instructions. The idea is, if you remember, that when we add a note, the only thing the user provides is the description, and the timestamp will be provided automatically, and the contact, doc ID will be provided automatically, and the owner will be provided automatically. And that's what's going on here with these hidden fields. So we've got a form. It's got a label, add a timestamp note, and a text field where you can type something in, and the name of that that field, will be the note field. And then everything else for this particular form object that's returned when we submit, we're going to compute. We're not going to display the field, but we'll still compute 3 field values. We'll compute the owner field as the value of this.props.owner. We'll compute the contact ID field as the value of this.props.contact ID, and we'll compute the created at field as a new date object, okay? And then when we do submit, which is presumably the next thing we have to worry about, okay, go down here. Okay, so when we do this submit, we now have to get the note, owner, contact ID, and created at. Note, owner, contact ID, created at. We extract that from the form. Okay, actually we could, we don't really actually have to get that here. We could have gotten it here, but we'll just get that from the form. And then we'll call notes insert with note, owner, contact ID, and created at. Okay, and so you could say note added successfully. Okay, so what that means is that we don't need header anymore. We don't need meteor anymore. We don't need contacts anymore. All right, now we get our green check. So so that looks pretty good. Okay, so we've added add note, contains a form schema. Each note has an owner, a note, an owner, a contact name created at. Okay. Okay, so now we have to add that form, that add note component that we just created, into our contact, so it shows up here. So we could add this card.content to provide an add note below the card.content for the field. So let's go to the contact component, and right below the feed, we can provide a new one called add note, and we need to import that. So import add note from add note. All right, we get the green check. And you're noticing now that add note is going to pass in two properties, the owner field and the contact ID. So add note, owner field, contact ID. So that's where those two values come from. And then we use them right here, okay, to provide the values for the form, which we then use to insert the note. Okay. So if we've implemented this correctly, this should look like this now, which it does. And if we add a note and press submit, we should actually get something to happen. So let's say met to discuss snorkels. Submit. Note added successfully. There it is. Called about the snorkels. Submit. There we go. Rang doorbell about snorkels. Okay, so we got a lot of notes for Henry. You know, bought a bunch of snorkels to sell to Henry. Submit that. Okay, and so now you can see that Our notes collection is getting updated, and our contacts collection stays the same, and we're combining them together and only displaying the notes, the notes associated with the particular contact that we associated with it when it was created. All right, so let's, as a last step, check for ESLint errors. So Control C, Meteor npm run lint. Great, no ESLint errors. So Control C to stop Meteor, stop your timer. So 33 minutes. Call it 35 or whatever. And commit and push our notes1 branch with the message notes1 finished in 34 minutes. So notes1 finished in 34 minutes. Commit to notes1, publish branch. All right. So that's kind of a long one and kind of a complicated one, but I feel like this is really essential work for you to do to get you beyond working with one collection. You got to work with multiple collections for all your projects, and to start to work through the problems with associating one collection with another. If you run into problems, work on it maybe 10 minutes, then ask for help, try to ask a smart question, post your repo so that people can download it and try to debug it, and have fun with this. It's really cool. This is, once you get through this, you're going to be ready to build anything, or almost anything. But, well, maybe not almost anything, but a lot of cool things you can now build once you can do this.